right, today we are diving into the book, The Four Disciplines of Execution by Chris McChesney and co-authors Sean Covey and Jim Huling. Now, once again, just as a reminder for those who might be joining for the first time, I'm Britain, by the way. We get comments about how our voices sound the same, so sometimes it's good to differentiate who's talking. But Stephen has more of a corporate background. I obviously don't have a real job. I play in the NFL
That's
at
a
the
real
moment,
job.
and
That's a real job, Brett.
yeah, but he'll be commenting more on that, and I'll bring some of this fun sports aspects to some of these principles and teachings.
No, absolutely. It's fun doing this with Britt, and I think we both bring a little bit different perspective. So going back to the four disciplines of execution. So when you first might see this book, you might think, oh, well, this is only for big companies with huge strategic type goals. And yes, there's a lot of examples. Thousands of organizations have used the four disciplines of execution to achieve major breakthroughs. So it's through Franklin Covey, which, by the way, we have no affiliation with, myself or Britain. Ironically, even though our grandpa started it, but we don't have anything to do with them. But the reason why this book works, and it's not just for corporations, is because it's built on timeless principles of human behavior. And those principles are focus, leverage, engagement, and accountability. So these disciplines aren't just for corporations. They can transform your personal life, family, sports team, or anything where execution matters. So in this episode, we're going to revisit some of the clips from my initial conversation with Chris McChesney, who has a lot of energy, by the way, you'll see in these clips. We're going to break down how the four disciplines apply to everyday life. So just to ground, but before we jump into the clips, because again, this is not, the purpose of this episode is not to be exhaustive. I just wanted to quickly recap the four disciplines before we hop in, though. So the first discipline is focus on the wildly important. So it's basically narrowing your efforts to just a few crucial goals that will make the biggest difference. The second discipline is act on the lead measures. So you need to identify and track the key activities that drive those goals and not just the outcomes. Discipline number 3 is to keep a compelling scoreboard. So you measure and make progress with visible, simple, clear tracking that motivates people to perform. And then the fourth discipline is create a cadence of accountability. So you're basically establishing a regular rhythm of reporting and commitments to stay on track. So together, these disciplines answer a simple but difficult question. How do you get the most important things done when everything else in life is screaming for your attention? So with that, let's get into the first clip where Chris shares a little bit about the background of how this book came to be.
My model for this was your grandfather. When I started, we just mentioned before the podcast started that I was Stephen R. Covey's publicist for a short time in 91. And when I started working for your grandfather, one of the things I realized was he didn't set out to write a book. 7 Habits may be the most influential personal development business book of all time. You could argue it's in the top 3 for sure. This was a methodology that he had baked for over a decade before he wrote the book. Right? So he starts in 76. It's not until the late 80s. And then they have to decide whether they will write a book. There was many people in the early Covey Leadership Center that didn't want to write a book. They didn't want to give it away. And so the methodology had baked for a decade. And I think that's one of the reasons it was so powerful. So back to your question, Stephen, we did the same thing. We were trying to solve the problem, not write a book. We had over 3,000 organizational implementations of this methodology for a decade. And people kept asking me, are you going to write a book? Is there a book? This is really good content. There should be a book. And all I could think about was your grandfather. Like, we're not ready. We're not ready. We're not ready. And so starting in 2002, the book is published in 2012. And yeah, there was some heavy duty research up front, but the real engine behind it was trial and error, scientific method, hypothesis testing.
I think the main reason why we chose to include this clip is simply for the credibility that comes with Chris McChesney and this book. It's a methodology that was put into place with over 3,000 organizations before they ever thought about even writing it down. I think there's something powerful about, not saying we're writing a book and we're going to find our methodology, but, the inverse. And so I just think it's something about kind of more principles versus fads. What are the quick fixes, more modern ways to approach things? And then what are the actual principles that are timeless, will always be relevant? So there's just a lot of credibility and implementation or organizational implementation to this book that prove why it's true, really. So the next clip, we're going to go more into detail on specifics. And specifically, this one is about, is execution a people problem or a systems problem?
We really went into this thinking it was a systemic problem, right? But the issues, and we'll point them out. So as we go into the disciplines, I'll tell you, there's a particular human tendency that undoes execution with all of these disciplines. And it's one of the reasons the disciplines are a little counterintuitive. So the problem really is very, very human. So the quick answer to your question is it's human, not systemic. Well, here's the ironic part about your question. The fix is systemic. So, there's a great quote. If you read Atomic Habits, there's a great quote that he has where he says, we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our systems. And so it's yes, the problem's human, but there's a systemic fix to the human problem. So I don't know if I'm not sure that's 100% clear, but that's how I process your question.
Man, I love this. I think too often we label a problem as human because it's kind of daunting to label a problem as systemic often. In sports, there is this concept of being like a gamer, right? Someone who just shows up in big games. I think it's something that's very celebrated, right? You look at the Michael Jordans of the world, it's just these clutch athletes. And everybody loves to compare people to these clutch athletes, and they admire these quote unquote gamers. And I just think there's a big misconception about what a gamer actually is. And I think it goes along with this principle where they think this gamer is someone who just rises to the level of occasion and plays out of their head in these high pressure situations. They play a step above what they usually play. But the UConn head basketball coach, Dan Hurley, won multiple national championships. He talks about this, and there have been some interviews where he's asked about, some of these close games in the tournament that they've won. And he says, look, there's not some magical rise to the occasion effect that we have. We just lean back on our preparation, our practice, and our habits. Those are what carry you in those moments. Navy SEALs, have these quotes up on their walls and in their training that in those moments of high pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you just fall to the level of your training. And I just think that that's true. And I think it's, you just fall to the level of your systems. I remember thinking when I was training, how can I simulate like high pressure situations in sports or situations with, consequences? And so even though I'm a football player, when I was training in between my lifting sets, I trained at a basketball gym and I used to go and shoot 10 free throws. And if I made less than 8 free throws, I had to run a ladder or I had to run a couple laps. So even though it had nothing to do with the sport I was training for, the goal was to practice putting myself in these high pressure situations. That was my system. Even though it had nothing to do with football, I really genuinely feel like practicing that helped me control and relax my body when I did come to high pressure situations in, these other.
That reminds me of Tiger Woods' dad when he was growing up, and he used to like drop the golf bag during Tiger's backswing, right? To do it. It also reminded me too, Britt. I don't know if you remember this, but when Britain was training to be punt returner to go at the time the University of Utah before his freshman year, we used to go out and we had a machine that would shoot a punt to him. And one time, I don't know if you remember this, Britt, but one time I bought an air horn on Amazon. I bought this air horn that would blow, that like literally is the loudest thing ever. And we'd have someone do the punt, and then I would run up to Britt and blow that air horn in your face. we're trying to like simulate that. Anyways, that just came to mind. But anyways, going back to this, the only thing I'll add is, again, when Chris McChesney says that the problem is human, but the fix often is systemic, I agree with that. I think for me on a personal level, something that helped me, and this going back to another book we reviewed before, Getting Things Done by David Allen, is his concept of having a weekly review where you spend 30 minutes to an hour reviewing your week, your upcoming week. And what I had struggled with was, I've got these high priorities, these goals that I want to accomplish, these things that I want to do. But I would go many weeks where I'd say, I actually didn't make any progress in these goals. And for me, the fix was, it was a systems thing. It was like, okay, I'm going to have a weekly review. This is a habit that I'm going to build. And I'm going to basically input and block out time on my calendar in advance so that I am actually achieving the high priority items that I have. So it's just it's a very simple thing, but I think it's a powerful thing because, again, I was struggling with a human problem, and the way that I went about trying to fix it, I'm not perfect, obviously, at this still, but if I have my weekly review and do that habit, I'm much more likely to focus on like my biggest priorities for that week because I block it out in advance. So just an example. So maybe just as you're listening to this, maybe a question you can ask yourself: where in your life do you blame lack of willpower? But maybe you could actually install a better system and that could solve the problem. And, what would that look like? Maybe think in terms of systems. But next clip we're going to go to is where Chris talks about the approach of using a rifle and not a shotgun. And it'll make sense as he explains it.
What the 4 disciplines of execution is it's a rifle. It's not a shotgun. It's a breakthrough formula. And I always think about this model because when we had years where we would talk about focus and we could just see leaders glaze over. And here's what's going on in their mind. First of all, we've never met a leader that doesn't say all the time, we've got to prioritize. We've got to narrow focus. It's like when you tell them to focus, they're thinking, yeah, no kidding. Like we said that yesterday, right? So that's the one thing they know is I got to focus. But the other thing they know is I got 20 things that need my immediate attention right now. And that dichotomy, that conundrum, it's a very frustrating dilemma. But when you can help them think about it in these terms, right? That, okay, yes, 80% is life support, right? All your KPIs, all your vital indicators are going to go in whirlwind, and it's going to take up 80%. And then you're going to give this disproportionate strategic treatment. In healthcare, when we introduce this idea in healthcare, they call it taking an issue to intensive care. There's lots of services around the hospital. There's only one intensive care unit, right? So what issue in your life, in your business, which patient are you going to take to intensive care?
I love that metaphor of intensive care. I think it's so good that we all have a dozen urgent things, but the idea that there's only a couple truly strategic things. So I think that's kind of the paradigm shift with this is you still do the whirlwind. In this case, when he's talking about business, he says, yes, 80% of your time is still focused on the whirlwind, the day-to-day of business, but you elevate one thing, maybe two, but one thing that you are going to give that disproportionate focus to, which is, again, that intensive care unit type of focus. And I think anyone who's been a part of a business probably can relate to this, where a leader will come in and say, all right, for this year, here's our 15 strategic priorities for the year. And everyone in the room just kind of shakes their head like, oh my gosh, like 15, like literally none of these are going to happen. And the whole point of 4 disciplines of execution is basically acknowledging that business kind of is chaotic and 80% of your time is focused on the whirlwind of business. But in order to execute and actually drive like a new strategic thing, that you basically need to have one thing that you can dedicate like 20% of your time to, and then put in these kind of disciplines around it to actually make it happen. So anyway, I think these metaphors are fantastic.
From a sports perspective, just talking about this reminded me of this past season in the Super Bowl. We'd gotten to the Super Bowl, so it's, at some point, don't change. Something's not broken, don't fix it, right? Our systems were working. So I think that's the 80% that he's talking about. 80% stays the same, but then we did have one or two plays in our playbook that we had not pulled out all year that we said this, we know exactly what will happen, what defense we're going to get and why this will be successful. So we are going to spend a disproportionate amount of time compared to what we normally do on these specific plays because we know it's going to be a big play. One specific example was the first drive, the touched it well. He got called down at the 1 to Jahan Dotson. Obviously, Jahan's the third receiver with AJ and Devontae taking up the majority of the targets. So we knew what type of coverage they were going to have on him if we got to this situation. And sure enough, Jalen saw it and audibled, and we had practiced this because we knew exactly what we were going to get. We didn't spend time on this throughout the regular season, but we knew, how big of an impact this would make. And sure enough, Jahan made a great move, and, the rest is history. But when your systems aren't broken or you have to spend 80 of your time keeping the normal operations alive, you do it. But then you send that disproportionate help and attention to X or whatever it is that is going to make a big impact. All right. So just if you had to pick one priority in your life right now to send intensive care to, an intensive care unit, what would it be? Where do you need a breakthrough and you need to give some disproportionate energy to? Now we're going to go to the next clip where he talks about the power of a scoreboard.
People play very differently when they're keeping score. You can look at a group of kids on a basketball court, and if they're shooting around or if they're keeping score is immediately apparent. This is not your corporate dashboard. This is not all the metrics in your whirlwind. This is very simple. This is a player scoreboard, right? You as the leader, Stephen, you might have a coach's scoreboard, right? Where you see all the data, but this is theirs. So it's just that product category you're trying to move, the the one or two key lead measures. And I got to see it in real time. Like, how are we doing versus where we are? And it's a little harder to do than it sounds. Again, getting the team involved in how you do it. We have an app for that. You can just buy an app and kind of follow those instructions. And then everybody's got it right on their phone. That's an easy way to do it. So disciplines 1, 2, and 3, I like to think about like that's setting up a high stakes winnable game, right? You took the most critical single chapter in your success book and you built a high stakes winnable game just around that one thing. It's really good for morale because sometimes there's so many things that are out of your control and that is always going to be there. But if there's one thing that the teams they can win at and it matters, much easier to keep morale on a team.
Yeah. So this reminded me of this idea, the power of a scoreboard. Anyone who's been in sales knows that, sales leaders and everything are obsessed with dashboards and scoreboards and all kinds of stuff. And there's definitely a strategy to how you do it. And I remember on one sales team in particular, we came up with a simple scoreboard. And the scoreboard, it was kind of, we had buy-in from the team members of the sales team. But the scoreboard was basically like, how many calls are you making a day? How many lunch and learn type of presentations are you doing? It was very simple, very easy, but it was just incredible how much that simple scoreboard elevated our metrics in the sales team. I'm thinking of, Jared, if you're listening to this, an old friend, Jared, got so excited by these. And it was amazing how a simple scoreboard increased the amount of meetings that we had, which ultimately led to more revenue, more deals. But it was literally just this simple scoreboard that the sales team could see every day that they were completely motivated by. It was pretty awesome to see, actually. And I think it mattered because they were involved in kind of building it out.
Yeah, I think this is like Coach 101. And what I like is that he really makes a point that you create this scoreboard in a fair environment because you have so many things that are outside of your control all the time. So you take the one or two things that are absolutely in your control in a fair environment and you create a game out of that in a way. You create competition, but healthy, happy kind of competition scoreboard. And I think that's very motivating. I mean, we have little games for every single drill we do and practice we do, so I totally relate to that. And I think, it's another thing he talked about. It's just there's a difference between the player's scoreboard and the coach's scoreboard. the manager, the coach might have so many different things on his radar, but that's so overwhelming. It complicates things. You might be able to be aware of that, but the people you're working with, is it really that necessary? Do they need to be aware of all of that? And so the player scoreboard should be much more simplified, have buy-in, like you said. So anyways, we're going to go to our last clip where he talks about accountability and gives us just a little summary.
If discipline 1 is the rock, 2 is the lever, 3 is kind of how we see it. Discipline 4 is the notion of force against leverage. What do I do this week to ensure that no matter what, we do those lead measures? So let's go back to diet and exercise. Okay, my lead measures really suffer when it rains outside because I don't like to run in the rain. I'm getting the gym membership this week. That's my commitment for the week. These are specific commitments that you make. I'm going to get to Whole Foods and get that recipe and get those products because I've been eating garbage and it's killing my caloric intake, whatever, right? But there's something I'm going to do this week that ensures that we are going to make good, we're going to pull the lever no matter what. Okay, I've got 2 new people on my sales team. They don't understand how to set up these meetings. I'm going to model this with 2 of them. I'm going to go on that meeting with Maggie, and I'm going to kind of model how that's done. And it's every week they change. It's very dynamic. The lead measures is we're going to hold that. We're going to keep pulling that lever till we see if it works. But the commitments, go back to the very, very beginning when we said urgency. Remember how the day job dominates? Mm-hmm. We're going to force some activities that without this cadence would not feel urgent. But now then I have to report on them the next week. So that cadence is this little 15-minute meeting the team holds every week, and everybody commits to doing 1 or 2 things that are going to make sure we can pull the lever this week. And then we got to report on it. And as the leader, this has to feel serious. Like, no, do not make this feel like preseason football. You know what I mean? Like, hey, guy, I know how busy you all are, and I know you hate having this meeting. Sorry to get you. No. Like, what's important is really determined by the way leaders treat things. So you start that meeting right on time. Okay, and then you report your commitment. These were my commitments for next week. Tony, what you got? Oh, I committed to this. I did. Somebody misses a commitment. You don't have to be a jerk. Just say, hey, Sue, if you get yourself in that situation again next week, will you call me and I'll help you on that commitment? She will never call you and she will never miss another commitment. Right? But here's the key. Commitments have to come from them. Right? Not from you. So you're pulling their innovation, their ideas, their initiative into a scoreboard they help create. Right? This is their game. They got to play the game, but it's their game. So discipline 1's counterintuitive because you got to say no to good ideas. Discipline 2 is counterintuitive because we always fixate on lags, not leads. Discipline 3 is counterintuitive because we like to make coaches scoreboards with lots of data. We need those, but this is going to be a player scoreboard. And discipline 4 is counterintuitive because the commitments have got to come from them.
Awesome. So I know in that clip that there's a lot that Chris shared. But I think he gets to the heart of execution there. That again, this weekly check-in is how they organize it with companies. But I do think weekly is a good cadence. But the weekly check-in where people own their progress. So again, this is a commitment. The best way to execute is you get commitment and buy-in from the team. So rather than top-down orders, this is kind of from bottoms up. So it reminds me of what our grandpa used to talk about this all the time about if there's no involvement, then there's no commitment. So people support what they help create. And I think that's kind of the power of the 4 disciplines of execution is at its heart, the reason why people execute, within these companies as this example is because they're involved in the problem and they have commitment because they're involved and they come up with these scoreboards and the things they want to report to. So anyways, I know it's a lot, everything that Chris talks about and the question of how do I apply this to my day-to-day life, but because these are based on principles, it doesn't have to just be a company. It can be in your personal life or with your family is all I'd say. Bert, do you have any other thoughts around that?
I would say a good portion, if not the majority of those listening to this, might not be managers in a company or something where you're commanding a sales team or whatever that is. But this idea of, I think about it especially with kids, of involvement and commitment. Our grandfather used to talk about just this systems of discipline where the kids, in a way, come up with the punishment for missing a curfew or whatever that is. And then if that line is crossed, it no longer feels like a punishment. It just feels like discipline, And I think that's, the way you go about it in more of a day-to-day life thing. I trained some of the high school coaches here in the state of Utah a few weeks ago up at the University of Utah. Had all the high school coaches come up, and I got to talk with them. And I said that one thing that I always felt was important that great coaches did is they got permission in a way from the best players on the team to be held accountable to these types of things. And I felt like that had a ripple effect to the rest of the team for these type of execution and accountability, was when the best player on the team almost gave permission to the head coach or to whatever coach that you can coach him hard, that you can hold him accountable, that you can yell at him in front of the whole team. Because then it shows, to everybody, oh, well, if that person can get yelled at, then I for sure can. Or if he can, be disciplined and be okay with it and take it, then I should be able to do that. So anyways, just a little tidbit I thought I'd share.
Sports are great, and the examples you share are great, Britt, because first of all, it's more exciting to talk about sports than business, but I think it just makes it relatable. So kind of to wrap things up here, again, what I love about the 4 disciplines of execution is that it takes the big overwhelming word of execution, which feels like a corporate jargon word in the first place, but it breaks it down into these principles that anyone can follow, whether you're running a business, you're part of a team, family, or just trying to move forward personally. These 4 disciplines give you a playbook and principles to move kind of idea to action and from action to result. So for me, the key paradigm for me is basically realizing that execution fails because of human nature, and the fix is systems that basically protect us from ourselves. That's kind of my key paradigm. How about for you, Britt?
Yeah, I would say mine is along the same lines of just how often do I think in my life I'm viewing something as a people problem when really it's a system problem. And what I love about this book is, okay, so let's diagnose this as a system problem. Now, here are a few things you can do to fix that system. The scoreboard, the accountability, more focus on certain things and less focus on other things. So it's just that same paradigm of how often throughout my day, even with inconsequential things, am I seeing things as a people problem when they're probably a system problem?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. So with all that, again, appreciate everyone for listening, tuning in. We'll be back in a week with another great book, and appreciate everyone's support. Make sure you're subscribed to, again, our podcast or YouTube channel, and then also we're on social as well. So any way you want to get it is great. We just appreciate you listening and exploring these principles and ideas together with us. So thank you, everyone.
Yep. Have a great week.